Alright, so this is video 3 of our continuing series of The Dawn of Man by Madruga Works, which essentially looks at a growing prehistoric village, and we take a look at prehistoric society through the lens of the people in this village, using computer simulations, obviously, to further historical thought. Obviously, the Neolithic era, as you can see here, things have changed pretty dramatically. Obviously, the Neolithic era typically kind of picks up around 8,000, 7,000 BCE with the invention of agriculture, and typically stretches to about 3,200 BCE with the introduction of bronze and what we would refer to as the Bronze Age. Obviously, we talked about the Paleolithic era and the Mesolithic era, and during those eras, obviously, people were largely hunter-gatherers in search of food. Obviously, by this era, people have started to settle down, primarily because of what you see here, agriculture. Agriculture is going to be a game changer, and it's probably one of the most important technologies in the history of man. And so people began to set up croplands, typically in areas with fertile river valleys, like, for example, Sumer, with the Tigris and the Euphrates, the Egyptians along the Nile, etc. And what's going to happen is humans began to start growing crops. And this changed everything because now essentially you've got diversification of labor, people who do different jobs. Now you're going to have villages that stay in one place as opposed to moving around a lot. You notice that the dwellings reflect this. And you begin to have true cities. This is what makes civilization as we know it possible. And also larger populations that come into the Neolithic era as well. All of these are possible because of farming. And so what we'll take a look at is some of the differences in our village here over this period of thousands of years, and some of the differences here in the Neolithic from the previous eras. So obviously we talked about how agriculture plays a role. Agriculture was done quite interestingly. They began to figure out to grow crops at different periods of the year so that they always had something to feed their bellies. These are typically grain crops over here, which have already been planted. Things like emmer, einkorn, and barley. These crops in particular were grain crops. They were fairly hardy. They were, I'm not going to say drought resistant, but better than some. And they produced high yields, at least for this time. And so that's why I think humans decided to go with grain crops. In addition, grain crops have a lot of calories, and they store very well. So typically you could store these goods in things like the haystacks that you see here, or in primitive granaries. And basically, as long as they're in the grain form, right, you can hold them for pretty good periods of time, and they'll basically, still be okay. Of course, once you make them into flour, right, that's of course when moisture can set in, and of course they can start going bad. But as long as you leave them in the grain form, typically they tend to last pretty well, and that's, I think, why humans went with grain crops. You also have, of course, other kinds of plants bringing in as well. These are basically like bean crops, lentils, which we call beans, peas, right, chickpeas, etc., bitter vetch. These were crops that were good because they could be grown in the winter. You could plant them in the winter and then you could harvest them in the summer. So while the grain crops were still growing, usually typically planted in the spring, right, this would give you some crops that you could eat in the summer as well. So every season, right, you wanted to have something that you were harvesting so that your people wouldn't go hungry. And I think that's one of the geniuses, right, of early agriculture. And so that's why they would decide to plant different kinds of crops at different times of the year. Other aspects that you see that's different about this village, probably the biggest one you can see are animals. We now have a collection of animals that we are not hunting. These are animals that live in the village alongside them. For example, Mr. Pig here. Mr. Wilbur here is domesticated during the Neolithic era. People started finding wild hogs, taking in their children, and basically raising pigs. You also have Mr. Sheep here, right? Obviously, Mr. Fluffy over here is very important because he's going to be responsible for producing wool, which people need to make clothing, and also, of course, his meat, which they could harvest from him as well when he gets too old to produce anymore. And then also, as well, you've got other animals among the villagers too. We already talked about dogs, so we don't have to talk about them again. But pigs, sheep. You've also got over here Mr. Goat, who's wandering around, and basically he's going to be important too because obviously the female goats are going to produce milk. And ultimately the goats are going to be around as well for meat as well. So here you can see somebody here who's butchering a sheep carcass. Ultimately, as sheep got too old to produce, right, they would ultimately be butchered, and then they could produce meat and various substances from them. So humans, I think, basically took the path of least resistance, right, kind of like electricity, in that they understood that, well, I guess we could, chase these guys all over the place and throw spears at them, or we could simply set up a house where they live, set up, pastures where they can roam, and it's a lot easier to get to them that way. And so I think that's one of the geniuses of the Neolithic as far as domestication. And certainly all of these animals play a major role in our societies today. So that's, I think, one of the big differences. Agriculture, domestication by the Neolithic are going to play some major roles. Another one is, of course, the size of the population, right? We're at a population now of about 130 people. New people just joined. I think the previous one we looked at was like in the 60s. So we've basically doubled our population because of agriculture. Agriculture, although it is hard work, it is not as dangerous as trying to hunt big, huge animals with giant tusks, like woolly mammoths, for example. And because most of these animals are dying off or dead by the Neolithic era, humans had to evolve, and they did. They started eating more cereals, and ultimately they evolved into the Neolithic village that you see here. So I think the population grows substantially because there's a little bit less risk involved. And obviously with grain, you can produce, substantial amounts of calories that are going to keep more people alive. In addition, the houses are different. As you can see, instead of the temporary tents that people would have that would move frequently, now we have a sedentary society. People are going to stay in one place because once you start growing stuff, you have to be there to harvest it, right? Otherwise, somebody else will come in and take your goods from you. So in this instance, people started building more permanent structures like the ones that you see here. These are primitive huts, which are modeled after some in Great Britain, Wales, and in Scotland. And they're basically made out of daub, basically a wooden lattice work with mud. And then also you would thatch the roofs, as you can see, with grains or pieces of grains that you had left, which was called the chaff. And basically at this point it produced a very viable structure. You would probably have some kind of hole in the top to release heat, like the structure that you see here, so that you didn't light it on fire. And then people ultimately could live inside of these in relative comfort for their time period. And so again, these are sedentary structures. This indicates that humans are going to be here 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, instead of, let's have something we can pack up and move really quick like animal skins. And also you have storage facilities that are here as well. These would be used to store tools, various kinds of things that were needed for the village. And so we begin to see that this is a society that is producing an excess of things that it needs instead of just barely scraping by to survive like some of the previous eras. Another aspect of this era is the incorporation of religion. Certainly the Mesolithic we talked about with the creation of totems and spiritual skull poles. By this era we begin to see what's known as megalithism. Basically the use of giant stones to essentially for various religious purposes. Again, this village being focused in Northern Europe and being a Celtic culture, stone circles were a big part of this. Obviously the most famous one that we know of is Stonehenge, right? But these obviously were important structures for delineating the seasons, for religious worship, and obviously worshiping the gods was a big part of living in a Neolithic society, just like in others. Dolmens, like the one that you see here, are also important. Dolmens obviously were funerary chambers that had religious implications as well. And so people in this era would transport these stones over long distances on sleds and then assemble them in the spots that were holy. And so all of these are, I think, reflective of the importance of how religion played a role in Neolithic society as well as past societies. These are stables over here. So as we mentioned before, this is where animals could basically be sheltered in the winter, right, when conditions got bad. And so ultimately the animals were going to live typically inside the walls where they could be protected from any kinds of raiders that would show up. Another note on that is you can see, of course, the town defenses. By the Neolithic era, we now have watchtowers, right? We have fences, we have gates. The reason for this, of course, is because as populations of humans grow, they start to come into conflict with each other over who gets the best agricultural land, and they start fighting. And so we begin to see that in the Mesolithic and in the Paleolithic era, human conflict was probably rarer because they were so few. But now by the Neolithic era, raiders are pretty regular. You can expect to get attacked, especially in this game, on a regular basis. And so we need to have defenses to be able to protect your people. And that typically involved building palisades, as you can see here, wooden stakes that would be designed to protect your structure. The one thing that is missing from the palisade is typically they would have a ditch in front of them that would make the palisade even more imposing. This combination of wooden stakes and ditches typically was the most primary defense even through the Middle Ages. There were many small villages that still use this. And of course they've got platforms, you've got watchtowers where people can essentially alert if they get attacked. So defenses are another nature of how the Neolithic era is different than previous eras as well. So ultimately, you can see people here, this lady just crushed some grain. Grain is going to play a major role in the diet. People would basically make it into flour and then cook it in bread. They didn't have large bakehouses yet. That's something that's going to happen later. But typically people would go to the campfire or the hearth. And this was obviously a way for them to relax, talk about their day, gossip. Here you can see a lady here is basically hanging out, right, eating some bread, right, that she's just made into flour. And so ultimately, these are ways in which people could kind of hang out, find out what was going on, and kind of achieve the more social aspects of life in this time period. And of course, we have just random bulls running around inside the settlement. That's always an interesting thing to see, is just a big cow running around, but sometimes that happens. But yeah, obviously, one last aspect to take a look at is the creation of clothing. So as you can see, these people are wearing very different clothing than what we saw in previous eras. Before, people were using basically like skins and such, right? These guys are basically wearing like tunics that are made out of linen. So this is an era, of course, where they can start growing linen, which you can see here comes from the flax plant, right? And this flax would be harvested and then made into linen at a workshop of sorts, a place over here, right, known as the weaver. And so people would basically weave the flax into linen, which was cloth, and then that cloth they could basically make into tunics, which people would wear in the summer and in the spring when it was warm. In the winter time, of course, people would go to wool, which of course was provided by the sheep that have now been domesticated. And this would basically keep them warm, right? It was lighter than wearing, leather and heavy garments, and certainly it was more practical in the environment of Northern Europe. And so all of these are ways in which humans have ultimately changed by the course of the Neolithic era. People still would hunt, but more sparingly. Certainly hunting wasn't as big a part of the lifestyle because now you had grains to supplement it. And so basically everybody would be required to help out when it becomes harvest time. And at that point, the people will go to the fields and they will basically harvest crops for the well-being of everybody. So this pretty much covers, I think, most of the Neolithic era and its importance. Certainly a big step forward in humankind, and certainly something that we'll reflect upon in future videos as we look at how humans evolve even further.